In this video, I'm going to show you how I would recommend drawing a nose. The first thing you need, obviously you need your paper. I'm going to be drawing this with a B pencil, but an HB pencil's fine, or a 2B pencil or anything like that, whatever you've got. Make sure you've got yourself a rubber to hand, because like I've said before, we're going to be using guidelines, and as you're working, you're going to be readjusting your drawing as you go. So make sure you've got a rubber to hand, and make sure you've got an image as reference. So in my drawing, I'm going to use this image here. It's really important that you have your image in front of you, easy to find, not sort of hidden away somewhere or not in a closed book. Make sure it's open, you're looking at it, it's right in front of you, and you're referring to it all the time. In the last video where you were drawing an eye, I was talking to you about the importance of observing what it is you're drawing. And again, whatever you're drawing, that's really important, that you are looking at all the detail all the time as you're creating your drawing. You're looking at the shapes, you're looking at where everything sits within the composition. You're looking at where the light is, the midtones, the dark shades. You need to be looking at this image as much or more often than you're looking at your own work, because you need to make sure that you've got this image in your mind as you're drawing it. Now, before you start, I would recommend drawing a line of symmetry. Now, when you're drawing your face, you usually start with a line of symmetry because most of the features on your face are fairly symmetrical, and that's the same with your nose as well. If we look at the nose, if we pick the center point, the distance between the center and the edge of the nose is exactly the same on either side. No one's got one side bigger nostril than the other. Similarly, the underneath parts of your nostril, they are the same size, they're the same distance apart. The edge to the inside should be roughly the same sort of size. Your nose also, as you start to shade up the middle of your nose, you want to make sure your shading goes in a sort of a straight line. You don't want to sort of veer off to the left or to the right with that. So I would always recommend, when you're drawing things like a nose or a mouth, when you're drawing something that is symmetrical, you draw yourself a line of symmetry to start off with. Now this line, I'm going to press down a little bit with it so you can see it, but on your drawing, this is going to be way too dark, because this line you're going to rub out afterwards. So make sure you draw this line of symmetry as light as you possibly can on your paper, so that it doesn't end up being a pain when you come to rub it out. The next thing I would draw is the line of the base of the nose. That's not underneath here, but it's where the nostrils sort of sit, and that's going to be roughly, we're just drawing just that base in there, so we've got something to work from. I'm doing this freehand. I haven't used a ruler to draw it. If you struggle to draw straight-ish lines, then use a ruler, but it doesn't matter if they're not perfectly straight. It's just there as a guide. So this here is going to be the center of my nose, round about sort of here in my image, okay? So the first thing I would recommend is start in the middle, and I'd probably start down the bottom. It's easier to start in the middle because that's on your line of symmetry. So I'm looking to see where this part of the nose, how far down does it go from that line that I've drawn across here. Some people might be deeper than others, perhaps. That's why you need to look at your image and look to see where everything should sit. And you can start just by marking it in, if that helps. Then I'm going to start by drawing either side. Now, when you're drawing something symmetrical, I would always recommend you draw both sides like I'm doing here at the same time. Don't draw one side and then try and draw the other, because it's so hard to draw one thing the same as something you've already drawn. It's just very difficult. As I'm drawing this, I'm going to keep readjusting it and evaluating what I've drawn. The lines I've drawn here, probably a little bit or not steep enough. So really that needs to come up a little bit more like that. So that's what I mean by constantly evaluating what you're doing and what you're drawing, and making little adjustments and rubbing things out as you need to. So as I'm coming up to the nostrils, I'm getting further and further away now from my line of symmetry. So to make sure that it's accurate, I mean, some of you might be good at doing this with your eye, but some people are not. So what I would suggest you do is measure it. So measure between there and the outside of your nostril, so here to here, and make sure it's the same on both sides. So you can either use a ruler to measure it, that's pretty straightforward. If you haven't got a ruler to hand, I haven't got one to hand, you can use your pencil to measure. So if you put your pencil on that center, that sort of line of symmetry, and then I'm just going to mark my nail where that line is, and I'm just going to bring it over. That's where that is, and that should be where this nostril finishes. So that's a tip, just in case you don't have a ruler, just to make sure it's the same, because if you've got one side longer than the other, it's just not going to look right, and you're going to spend ages sort of fiddling with it and changing it and wondering why it's not quite right. So use your pencil or get a ruler to measure these bits, just to make sure that they are fairly accurate. So that's the inside of my nostrils I've drawn there. The next thing I'm going to draw is the outside of my nostrils. So I'm going to look at the distance between here and here. Now you'll notice as I'm drawing this, I'm looking at this a lot as I'm talking to you. I'm referring to this, I'm looking at the tiny details, even like the detail of how far is that to that compared to that to that. That's a slightly smaller space. If you're not sure, you can measure it. How big is that compared to that? If you're not sure how big you should draw it, just measure it and see. So make sure you're constantly referring to your image. I would say the nostril probably comes out to about here. That looks about right to me. And then I'm going to use my pencil just to measure it to the other side, just to make sure that it's the same on either side. Just mark that there, and I'm just marking the lines down, okay? Don't mark, like when you're measuring, don't mark that way, because then I won't know where to finish my drawing. If you mark at a right angle to where you're measuring, then you know exactly where to finish that part of the drawing, okay? So that's that. So now I'm going to look at the underneath part of my nostril. So I've marked in where the nostril is going to go. How far is it going to come down? So common mistakes people make is they'll join it up here, or they'll have it coming down here and have this looking like a circle, and different things like that. So look to see where the nostril comes in underneath this part of the nostril here. Okay, so it sort of comes under there a little bit, maybe a little bit higher, and then it sort of comes round. I'm going to go over that line slightly, but I need to do the same on that side. And then it sort of comes round. Now I'm not going to draw anymore, because this is not actually a line, this is going to be shading. So don't draw a line up the side of the nose, because there isn't a line there. And if you draw a line up there, you're going to see it, and it's not going to look good, and it's going to be hard for you to mask, or you're going to end up having to rub it out. So just, I would say, finish this line roughly about here, and then the rest you'll shade in. Then on this side I'm going to do the same thing. If you want, you could measure between here and here and mark it out on here. But I'm just going to do it by eye. But if if you feel it's not quite right, or you're not sure, or you're not good at doing it by eye, then measure it as best as possible. Now, before I do anything else, I'm just going to look at it. Okay, I'm going to look at this, and I'm going to look at this, and I'm going to see if they look accurate. So there are tiny little things that I would change. Like, for example, this is a little bit higher than here. So now, before I do anything else and say, right, I've finished, I'm just going to do some little adjustments just to sort of get my drawing looking a little better, a little more accurate. Okay, that's a bit better on that side now. I think what I've drawn here is a little bit small compared to this one, so I'm just going to bring it up slightly, just like that. Sometimes, if something's not quite right, it could only be like a couple of millimeters that you need to change to get that accurate. So it's worth spending, just looking and evaluating what you're doing as you're doing it. Once I've gotten to that stage, that's all the drawing done. The rest is all through shading. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rub this out slightly. I'm going to leave it a little bit visible, just so when I'm doing my shading up here, I want to make sure that my shading doesn't end up going over to the left or the right. But all the other guidelines, I'd recommend rubbing them out now, so that when you start shading them, these lines aren't going to be showing through. Okay, I'll just bring that back a bit. Right, so the next stage now, there's one other little thing that I think I'll add in. The edge here, this line here where the sort of the nostril ends, if I look at this, it curves around a little bit. Now that will be mostly shown through my shading, but I'm going to mark that in now, because as I sort of looked at that, I just thought I wanted to add that in. So you just bring that round a little bit. Now that's all there is to it. Now it's all about the shading. So when you start shading, again, you need to take some time to look at your image and identify where are the light areas. So on here, I've got lightest areas here. Then I've got this bit, it's not quite as bright as here, but it's pretty bright. That's the lightest part of the whole image. Then I've got another small highlight on the nostrils here, but this side's a bit bigger than this side, this highlight slightly. Then it sort of fades down. I've got this bit here, which is fairly light, but not as bright as the highlight. Then I've got some shading here. Then I've got some slightly darker shading underneath the nose here and underneath here. Then this sort of darker shading sort of travels around here underneath the nostril, and then it sort of comes around here. And then the dark shade, I've got dark shading under here, shadow under the nose, and the darkest shading is inside the nostrils. So that is what I'm going to be spending time doing now. Now for my shading, to keep it fairly quick, because I could sit here and make a video and spend like an hour shading this in or more, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do some cross hatching just to sort of build it up fairly quickly. If you're not sure where to start, then start with some of the shading. So underneath this nose here, I've got some shading. At the moment, I'm still using my B pencil. I haven't moved over to a darker pencil yet. I have got a 6B pencil here, but the problem is if I go straight in with my 6B pencil, shading some of these lighter shade tones, what I might end up doing is accidentally making them too dark. So I'm going to stick with my light pencil for now, because I can always go over it with my darker pencil after to darken areas. It's much easier to darken your shading than it is to lighten it, because that involves you having to rub it out and then work over the top of it again. So what I'm doing now as I'm talking to you, I'm just starting to bring in some of this shading underneath here, and I'm keeping it fairly light at this point. And like I said, I'm doing cross hatching because it's nice and quick to show you. But you can do some cross hatching if you want, or you can shade it however you feel more comfortable. It's up to you. But I quite like cross hatching for quick working. So now I'm starting to bring in these tones. So it's darker here than it is here, and that's a bit darker than here. I haven't shown that yet because I'll get to that in a minute. All I'm doing is putting down the foundation of where some of these darker shadows are here. And if I do accidentally do too much shading, as is very easy to do, then all I need to do is just rub that out. And if I press nice and lightly, that'll be easy to rub out. So at this point, I'm pressing so lightly with my pencil. I'm not pressing down hard at all. If I was to press hard like this, then it would be a nightmare to rub out, and I would end up with a drawing that's only got one tone of shading, which is dark, where I want a range of tones. I want lights, I want several different shades of mid-tones, as well as some darker tones in there as well. So what I'm doing now is I'm just working around this shape here, and I've perhaps made that a little big there, but that's fine because I can bring that shading round. I'm pressing really lightly. There is some shade, I'm sort of here at the moment, and there's some shading up the side of the nose. I'm looking at my line of symmetry, which I've mostly rubbed out, but I can still see it a bit, to make sure I don't go wonky, because that's a common mistake that a lot of people make. I've seen that a few times, wonky shape, wonky noses. So still all one tone at the moment. I haven't built up different tones yet. If you're more confident, you can build up your dark tones as you go. You can build up your dark tones, your mid tones as you go. But if you're not that confident, I would say keep your shading really light to start off with, because once you start going dark, you might forget to sort of bring it back, and you end up with like this really dark nose with not a lot of highlights. Now down here it's looking a bit odd because obviously that needs to be really dark, but I'm going to leave that for now, and I'm just going to sort of bring the shading around here where this highlight is. I'm going to bring the shading sort of over that really lightly, so lightly, because it's not as light as here. So if I left it white, it would look as light as this shading. So I do want to shade over it. I've obviously got some darker shading behind it. If I get my 6B now, I can then start adding in some of this darker shading. Make sure it's shading. What you don't want to end up with is this black line, okay? Because that's not going to look very realistic. So just blend that into the skin behind this person's nose. It's sort of, this shading sort of comes around here like this, and again I'm just doing sort of simple crosshatch shading, but it's looking all right. And with this I can start to go dark, but I don't want to go too dark because that is not as dark as it will be under there. Okay, now at this point I'm just gonna bring that in so it looks like I've started to build up some of the cheek there. And then under here there's some darker shading there, so I'm going to bring in some of this dark shading here. And there's a little bit there, but I don't want to overdo it. And there's a bit there as well. And over here I've left this really light bit, and this is very similar to this tone. I think maybe it's a bit bigger, maybe it's the same tone but a bit bigger, but it looks like there's more light on this side than there is on that side. So I'm going to shade over it very lightly because I don't want it to be as light as my highlights when I add them in. Don't worry, that's not my highlight, by the way. That's just as far as I've gotten. Obviously, the highlight's going to be much smaller than that. So I'm just going to keep working into that and building that up a bit at a time. And as I come around here, I'm going to darken this shading just here a little bit darker under there. Bring that up. And I'm just trying to create this ball shape because on the edge of the nose there is a ball. It is a ball on the end of your nose, isn't it? So your shading sort of needs to sort of show that, and you can see the ball of this nose because it's mostly light. So you've got like light, and then you've got the highlight on top where you're definitely going to leave it the white of the paper. So I'm sort of shading. You might call this directional shading, where I shade my lines in the direction of sort of a rounded shape to kind of emphasize the fact that this is a rounded sort of ball of the nose. And then as I come up here, I'm just going to speed this up a bit and put some cross hatching up the side of the nose. This side looks very similar to this. This perhaps is, yeah, it's about a similar sort of tone. So that's what I want to mirror on here as well. And I also want to make sure that the highlight is the same on either side of this little line of symmetry that I can still see here. And I'm just going to build that up. I'm going to put some darker shading on this side of the nostril just to make this stand out a little bit more. What I like to do also is move my paper around as I work. I haven't been doing that for this video because, you know, it's going to be harder for you to see what I'm doing. But I generally do like to move my paper around as I'm drawing, just because I find it more comfortable. And again, be careful not to overdo this dark shading over here, because there isn't a lot of dark shading on this side of on the actual face, but it's just to emphasize this bit here is darker there. So I'm just gonna sort of bring that out a little bit. And then I'm gonna tackle under here, because once I add the darker shading under there, my nose is gonna start to look much better now. So I'm gonna make sure that's nice and neat, because it's a really sharp line there and there, which I kind of don't have yet at the moment. And be careful not to just do a black outline under the whole thing, because there isn't, okay? So just make sure that you, you know, only put really dark where it actually is really dark, and don't overdo it. And then I'll just bring that around. It gets lighter, the shading does, as it comes down. If you look here, it sort of gets lighter and lighter slightly. So I want to get that gradual blend just by sort of, you know, so you could do one bit, if I show you on this side, like a harder sort of edge here, and then lighter shading, and then to blend that in, just sort of work over the top of it, you know, a bit lighter than you pressed here and a bit darker than you pressed here, just to sort of blend that in, so you get a blended sort of gentle gradual shade. And then underneath the nose there is a shadow, especially under here there's a bit of a shadow, so I want to put that in there. And then I'm going to just bring the shading round to here, around this bit here. Right now, as I'm shading, I'm pressing really lightly with this pencil because it's a very dark pencil, and I don't want to make this shading under here too dark. It is darker than any shading up here, but I don't want to make it so dark. And I can always go back now and maybe darken and go over these nostrils, because like I said, it's best to go lighter than you think, because then you can always go over it and make it darker. Whereas if you've made it too dark, it's always much harder then to work, you know, back to light. Okay, and that's pretty much what I would do. Looking at this now, I don't know, just a little bit darker there. Obviously it's not finished yet, but I'm gonna sort of, you know, I think you get most of the point here. But I'm just gonna continue working on that. Then round here there's some darker shade on here, and just spend some time working those through. If you don't have different gradient pencils and you only have one pencil, like an HB or a 2B or something like that, you can still get these light and dark tones. It just means you've got to press much harder with your pencil to get the darker tones. It's just easier when you've got gradient pencils, and it requires less effort. But if you don't have gradient pencils, then you know, you can still get the same effect with one pencil. All right, there's obviously a bit more shading up there and a bit more to do with that, but I'm going to pretty much leave that there for now. One more little thing, some people like to use cotton buds for blending, okay? Personally, I don't think that it's necessary. I quite like sometimes seeing the textured lines in a drawing, but if, you know, that's just me, it's a personal preference. If you want to blend, you can do. If you're not sure whether you should blend or not, there's no real reason that you need to blend, but some people do like to blend. And the reason why I'm going to talk about it is because just please make sure you don't use your finger to blend, because you end up making a giant mess. You got oil in your fingers and that ends up going on the paper as well, and then you could end up making it go all grey. You lose your highlights, you lose your dark areas, you get messy fingers as well, and it's just not a good idea. So if you like to blend, you can use a blending pencil, but if you don't have a blending pencil, a cotton bud, or if you don't have any cotton buds, just a tissue, just ball it up into like a little ball so it's a bit like a cotton bud end, and just use that just to do some gentle blending if you want. If you do use a cotton bud for blending, what it does is it just softens your pencil lines basically, so you don't see the harsh sort of pencil lines. Personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with seeing those pencil lines in a drawing like this. Perfectly, I quite like that. I'm more of a messy sort of style myself, but some people like to go neat and really make it really tidy and make it, really sort of, I don't know. So if you're using a cotton bud, just make sure you don't overdo it, because it's very easy to use a cotton bud and what you do when you go over with the cotton bud, you're blending the graphite. So the graphite's going to hide all your highlights, and it's also going to dull your dark areas. So just be very careful not to overdo it, because it's very easy to. But if you do accidentally overdo it, then just use a rubber just to bring back your highlights, and then just use a pencil again to go over your darker areas so that you don't sort of lose them. But sometimes using something to blend is a good way of going from light to dark if you struggle with that. So here it goes, it had like a darkish tone and then it went to light, so you could use a blender to sort of make that a bit more gradual perhaps. Some people might find that easier doing it with a cotton bud than maybe with the pencil. So if you want to use something like a cotton bud or a tissue, that's fine. Just be careful not to overdo the blending, because you could end up with just a grey, dull looking mess. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for now. But I would say make sure you spend probably a good hour on this drawing. This so far has been 22 minutes, this demonstration. So if I was to, keep working on this, I would probably, another sort of half an hour, and I think I'd get this to a stage where I'd be quite confident that I was happy that that was finished. Okay.